Hello, everyone, and welcome to PyData Global 2025. We're excited to have you join us. Feel free to use the chat to connect with fellow attendees and share your thoughts during the session. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A tab and we'll address them at the end of the session. Now, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Malte Tichy. They'll be presenting a talk entitled Reviving Survival Analysis, Timeless Yet Overlooked. Please give it up for Malte.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Peyton. It's a great pleasure to be here and to introduce you to survival analysis. So I'm working in data analytics and AI at Siemens Gamesa. And if you say survival analysis, then that's a topic that on the one hand is quite established in traditional fields like engineering and medicine, but you don't see that much of it in PyData meetups and conferences. And this is what I want to change, because I would argue that survival analysis is actually one of the oldest problems in data science. And I would like to, yes, change the slide. Here we have it. So I would argue it's a very ancient and old problem. And you can go back to 1600 to find authorities who collect data on how many people died or were born in a given week. For example, that actually quite terrible week in 1665, where 3,800 people died due to a plague. And to put that in relation, only 166 children were born. So that data was used to make the very first forecasts for how long do people live, and these very first forecasts were actually age independent. So they would just tell everyone, hey, you have like 18 years left or so. So it took almost 100 years until 1693 when Edmund Halley, so you might know him from the Comet, started to make life tables that are age dependent. So now the prediction of remaining lifetime is also a function of the age itself. The older you get, the shorter is the remaining lifespan. So why did people do that? Why did they care at all? Well, in today's words, we would say they had the business case because the church needed to pay pensions to the priests and to their widows. So they needed to calculate how high these pensions could be. So that was actually the trigger for all the development of statistics and eventually of data science. So fast forward 400 years, it's quite remarkable that the first book about machine learning and survival analysis is being written right now. You can access it on that website here. So I will introduce you to the statistical survival problem and how we deal with such populations. We will then see the viable distribution, which is very useful if you want to model such populations. We will then go beyond the single viable distribution, see how we can combine different risks and model like many situations that you all already know in a similar fashion. Then we'll talk about the distinguishing feature of survival analysis, that is censoring, that we have a data set where a lot of the information is hidden from us because we don't know yet when somebody will die or when a component will fail or so on. And we'll then see how we treat these problems in a Bayesian way and how machine learning will lead to a really great degree of individualization in today's survival predictions. So let me introduce you to the overall statistical survival problem. So we want to predict the expected lifetime of a unit. So for example, a mechanical unit like this one here that is started up in time and then, which is then functioning for a while and will break and fail after its lifetime. Now we don't have only one of these components, but we have many of them. So we have an entire population. And we want to predict how long they live because on the one hand, if we have that data, probably we are also responsible for having all these units up and running. So we have to plan the spare parts and we have also to plan how to pay for these spare parts. So we have to react. But we can also try to improve things so we can identify the good and bad subpopulations. We can optimize the manufacturing of these units to increase the lifetime. And we have already seen two survival problems. So the original literal survival problem, when will that living being, that human, die? And we have also seen now the survival problem in engineering, when will that device fail? But there are many other problems that are in fact survival problems. For example, when will an employee quit? When will the shipped item be returned? When will the customer be served in a call center? When will that couple divorce? When will an unemployed person find a job? When will a lightning strike here? Or when will that radioactive nucleus decay? I mean, these are all problems from very different fields, but at the end of the day, it's something. You have a startup, you have one state, and you're interested in when does the state change to another state, typically a failure or a divorce, or the shipped item to be returned. So if we now have such a population of many units and we have collected all the failure ages, the question arises, how can we describe it? How can we visualize the data set? So let's assume we have T1, T2, T3, and so on. These are the failure times. Then it makes a lot of sense to establish the cumulative failure probability of the population. And for that, we can first look at the cumulative failure probability of the individual units. So for the first unit, we know it was alive until T1, and exactly at T1, we are absolutely certain that it fails. So as expressed as probabilities, it's 0 for quite a while, and then it immediately jumps to an absolutely certain 1 when it has failed at time T1. And a full analogy for the second unit for the third unit, we have a step function that jumps from a 0 until that failure time, and then it jumps up to 1. We can now sum up all these different step functions and get the empirical cumulative failure probability of a certain population, which I've write here as a sum of the step functions, or which I've write here as a theta function. And if you do that, you get a picture like this one, where you have the cumulative failure probability as a function of age, and you can read off many different interesting properties. For example, here you see that after 5 years, about 14% of your items have failed. After 10 years, 64% have failed. And good news for people in e-commerce who are sending out packages, and for the people who are married, I mean, this curve doesn't necessarily have to converge at 1. It can also converge at a smaller value. So we can read off what fraction of the population will eventually experience the event. In this case, the entire population experiences the event, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So now we know how to describe the data set, and the question arises, what is a good distribution to describe this relationship here, or like to describe the functional form that then the empirical data takes. And the simplest assumption that we can make is that the failure probability is constant and independent of anything that you can think of. And then that would mean that in each time interval, the same fraction of the population will fail, so the population would be exponentially decreasing. And that allows us to write down the cumulative failure probability as 1 minus e to the minus tau divided by theta. So tau, that's the age that will have a time dimension, for example, years or nanoseconds or something, and then you divide by some scale parameter that has the same dimension. And then you get a cumulative failure probability that looks like that. That's simply an exponential with different scales. So depending on the scale, the fraction of your population that has failed increases faster or slower. Now that's a very, very simple case, but you actually find this out there in nature or in business. There are many examples for such memory-less time-to-event processes. For example, if you have a random assignment call center, this is how long your customers will wait. More in general, the time between the arrivals in the constant rate Poisson process will behave exponentially. Radioactive decay is, in physics, an example for an exponential process, but also the time until a car has its next accident is exponentially distributed. But still, on overall, this assumption that the failure probability be constant, that's a very strong assumption, and you do find many cases where that is violated. And there's a minimalistic improvement that we can make on the cumulative failure probability here to account for that, and that is to introduce a shape parameter. So you see we're still dividing the age tau by the scale eta, but then we're taking this to the exponent of a shape parameter beta. And the shape parameter has then the following impact. So in green, we see the exponential distribution with a shape of 1. But if we have a shape that is smaller than 1, we first have a sharp increase of the failure probability for low ages, and then it becomes flat towards higher ages. While for the blue line, the shape parameter is larger than 1. We have a flat or a slow increase at the very beginning of the lifetime, and then the increase becomes stronger and more sharp towards the end. So this is why it's called the shape parameter, because it really changes the shape of the distribution. And also here we find examples in real life that can be described by that. A shape parameter smaller than 1, that refers to early life effects or infant mortality. For example, when we have production defects in a factory, also these will be effects that we see at the beginning of the lifetime. And shape larger than 1 means we have aging effects. For example, we have mechanical fatigue. I mean, we have a component that's just being used a lot and is wearing out. It's just breaking with time. So let's go back to the original literal survival problem, but let's use a little more up-to-date data set here. So this is the annual death rate by age group for the United States in 2023. And the way you can read this bar chart here is that out of 1,000 people that you can imagine that just have survived a certain birthday, say the 85th one, you can read off how many of them on average will die during the next year. So if you're 85 years old, then on average, the probability that you die next year is 10%. And that probability decreases when you go to younger ages, but there is a minimum somewhere, namely at 5 to 9 years old, so for children. And then it goes up again. So we somehow have both aging and infant mortality in the human population today. So one viable distribution will not be enough to describe both of them, and we have to combine these. And this is actually possible quite nicely. So let's say you have different risks that are described by these fj, then we can calculate the total risk f of tau by combining these as follows. So f of j is the probability of failing from the jth risk by time tau. So the probability of surviving the jth risk is then the complement, so 1 minus fj. If I have several risks and I want to survive overall, then I have to survive each and every one of them. So I have to multiply all of them. That gives me the probability of surviving overall. And then the probability overall of failing is again the complement. So this is why we have the structure of 1 minus the product 1 minus f. But yeah, so we can combine different of these processes with different shape parameters together. And this is how it then looks like. Here I have, again, an artificial data set where I have an early life risk with a shape of 0.4 together with an aging risk with a shape of 6. And then we get a cumulative failure probability that someone has this bumpy shape and a few structures. And it often also makes sense to plot the derivative of that. That's the hazard. So that's the conditional probability of failing at the given age, provided that we have survived until that age. And here we see that we have the early life failures, then the curve goes down, is flat for a while, and then goes up again for high ages. And that's called the bathtub curve because, well, it looks like a bathtub. And this bathtub curve is quite universal. You find this in so many places. I mean, even in software. I mean, early in the software lifetime, you have bug fixes just after the release. Then you have a plateau of productivity, then it works fine for a while, and then somehow you have new environments where it's difficult to adapt, and so you have aging, and things become complicated again. For machines, for electronics, in the early age, you have the production defect, you have a burn-in phase, things are not working so well, then it's fine for a while until you have the wear out, until the mechanical parts are somehow breaking due to stress and with time. But also for a building, I mean, if you have a brand new building in the early ages, you have settlement cracks, you have paint peeling off, I mean, those kind of problems. And if the building is then very old, the mortar will start to decay. I mean, it has been out there in the weather, in the rain, in the snow, and in the sun for a long time. You have the moisture damages that come with age. And I think this bathtub curve, we all have an intuition for that, because I mean, imagine you are asked to board a plane that has never flown before, that's just brand new coming out of the factory. So I would probably feel a bit uncomfortable. And this is also why the first flights are done with test engineers. And the first time you are allowed to board the plane will be once that plane has actually flown quite a few hours. So we are absolutely sure that there are no early life failures that can occur. On the other hand, you also don't want to board an 80-year-old plane or so, where you are afraid that now, due to wear out, some components wouldn't work anymore. Yeah, so that's about the different probability distributions. But there's one elephant in the room here, that is that this picture here that I have of the population is a bit idealistic and not really realistic, because what we have in practice is that we don't start up all the components at the very same time, but they are started up at different times. And we don't see all the failures at once. We don't have the entire data set, but we are also somewhere in time, and we can only look into the past. We can't look into the future. So we might have a situation like that one. We have started up a couple of the components. We have observed some failures. We have observed some components that are still alive, but they could fail tomorrow, or they could be working for another 10 years or so. So we do have a lot of ignorance, a lot of things that we don't know that we have to actively manage. And this will change in time. So time will pass. Our knowledge about the population will also change in time, and we somehow need to deal with it. So let's go back to the cumulative failure probability, which is very useful to describe the population. And the question arises, what happens if we don't have the full visibility like here, but we have certain components where we didn't observe a failure, but we simply know they have lived at least until age T2, T3, but we don't know whether they're still alive or they broke. So to deal with that on the formal side, I've introduced this delta parameter. Delta equal to 1 means the component has failed at the time T1. Delta 2 equal to 0 means the component has been censored at time T2. So it means we have observed the component to be alive until T2, and from that moment on, we don't know. Maybe it has failed immediately after T2, maybe it is still alive. And the question arises, how can we now have, again, like a semi-empirical cumulative distribution function? And the idea is that we can, for every censored component, look into those components that are older or that have failed at older ages, in this case, the fourth component, and use that CDF, that cumulative failure probability to fill up the unknown in a way. And if you do that, you get the Kaplan-Meier estimator that was introduced in 1958, and it is now being used in many, many different places. And thankfully, you don't need to implement that formula yourself, because you can find implementations in Python in the package Lifelines, and also in R in the survival package. So how does the Kaplan-Meier estimator look like in practice? Let's have a look at this synthetic small data set. T takes the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the first component is censored at time 1. The second component fails at time 2. The third component is censored at time 3, and so on. And we can establish on the individual unit level the semi-empirical estimator. So for units 2, 4, and 5, that's easy, because we know for sure they were working until ages 2, 4, and 5. For units 1 and 3, we are imputing the unknown part with the data of all the units that come later. And we can sum up all these individual unit estimators to get an estimate for the entire population, to get like a semi-empirical picture of how that population looks like. This is the de facto standard if you have survival data, so it's used a lot in medicine and engineering, and this then allows you also to do a direct comparison with any model prediction. It's a parameter-free method. So, I mean, there was no parameter that I introduced, but it's important to note it's not assumption-free. And the assumption that is behind that is actually a maximum likelihood assumption. So that also becomes important, because sometimes that assumption might also be very strong and give you slightly peculiar shapes, but that's essentially what's behind the Kaplan-Meier estimator. So not only do we need to deal with censoring when we describe the data, but also when we model it. I mean, when we train a model, we need to know what do we do with these censored events, because we cannot just throw them all out. I mean, we would be throwing away so much data, so much information. And yeah, for example, for the log likelihood, the way you would deal with that is that for those events that you have observed, you treat them the usual way. So you take the logarithm of the probability of having observed the failure at that exact time. And for the censored events, you actually need to take the probability of not having observed the failure by that time. So it's you see that on the left-hand side, you have a lowercase f, so that's the probability. On the right-hand side, you have an uppercase f, so you have the cumulative probability. So you can derive that, and yeah, for the different methods, how you want to train your model, find a way that is the correct way how to deal with censoring. This is how you do it for the likelihood. Now, if you have done that, you can train a model. And here I have an example when you do a Bayesian fit on a synthetic data set, what comes out. And so I have a data set that I generated with a model with a Weibull shape of 2. That's the blue line. And that is the same in all the 4 quadrants here. And I generate 4 different data sets. On the upper row, I have 100 units. In the lower row, I have 10 units. So I have lots of data, well, moderately large data set, and a very small data set in the lower row. Then on the left-hand side, I have a high degree of censoring. So I actually hide a lot of that data then to my model training. On the right-hand side, I have low censoring, and so this effect is much smaller. The green line is then the Kaplan-Meier estimator. So it's just the semi-empirical way of describing the data set. And every one of these small black pluses that you see there represents one of the censored units. So you see like the age at which the unit was censored here. And you see on the left-hand side, there's much more censoring than on the right-hand side. And then the red line is then the mean of the Bayesian fit. And you also see the uncertainty band. And you also see how this uncertainty band has very different shapes. And so if you start on the lower left, you see we have observed only one failure, and then so train a model on this one failure. And not too surprisingly, there's a huge uncertainty band coming out of that. Now, if we increase the data size, that would bring us up. We have observed more failures, and the uncertainty band becomes smaller. Same thing happens if we go right. So we have only 10 units still, but we have lower censoring. Also, the uncertainty band becomes smaller. And if we have both low censoring and lots of data, so that's the upper right part, then the uncertainty band becomes much more narrow, and the Bayesian fit matches really well a true generating model. So we see that in the case of survival analysis, we have 2 sources of model uncertainty. It's not only the quantity of data that is a problem, so the typical statistical noise that we have. We want to have lots of data typically, but also the information content of the data. So do we have a lot of censoring, or do we have little censoring? So both aspects play a role. And we also find sometimes unexpected behavior in these situations. So for example, in certain situations, a new failure can actually be good news. So imagine you are in this situation here. You have 9 units, you have observed 3 failures, you have a certain Weibull model, and you do a Bayesian fit, and you expect 88% of failures after 10 years according to that fit, because you have these 3 failures here that come at around 7 to 9, let's say, years of age or so. Now you're being called and told, oh, there's another unit that failed, and it failed very early at age 2. Now, is this good news or bad news? Well, this will depend very much on what is your assumption on the modeling. In this case, if you model the same if you fit the same distribution, the distribution shape will be lower and will be more compatible with a failure mode that is quite age independent, and this pushes down the probability to experience a failure until 10 years from 88% to 80%. So in this case, having observed a new failure, so having more failures in the data set, seems to be good for the KPI, how many units fail after 10 years. So you find lots of these effects that are maybe not so intuitive. So it makes sense to really sit down and do the entire calculation. Yeah, so now, of course, there are these 400 years that have passed, and in the last 30 years or so, we have seen so many machine learning algorithms, and the question arises, how can we bring this together? So there are two approaches to that. On the one hand, when we have a survival problem, we can really open the machinery of our algorithm and make survival-aware machine learning algorithm. So we get survival trees or random survival forests. On the other hand, we can also map a survival problem to a regression problem, solve the regression problem with any machine learning model that can handle it. That machine learning model doesn't even know, doesn't even need to know what's survival at all, and we can convert it back to a survival problem eventually. And what this allows us to do is to get an unprecedented degree of individualization. I mean, remember 400 years ago, the very first forecast for survival was just a plain number for everyone. Then we had the age dependence that said, if you are so and so many years old, your life expectancy is so and so on. And today, with machine learning, we can take into account all the individual factors. Now, in our case, for some mechanical units, we would take into account the operating conditions, the stress, the maintenance, everything, how you deal with these components to really then get the survival trajectory of the individual units. And you can predict the life expectation as a function of age, but also of many other covariates. Yeah, so that was my introduction to survival analysis. So the messages that I hope survive are that survival or time to event problems are quite everywhere. So I'm pretty sure that in the domain that you're working, you will find a survival problem as well. You see here the packages that can be used to deal with them. The distinguishing feature of survival analysis is that we have the censoring challenge. And this is why I also find this so interesting, because we have to actively manage what we don't know. And yeah, the combination of modern individualized machine learning with survival is really interesting, and we allows a lot of individualization and very precise forecasts. Yeah, that's it, and I'm happy to take your questions, of course. Yeah, so I saw somebody would like to see the slides. Yeah, I can share them on Discord later today. Yeah, and I should definitely model the survival of the audience's knowledge about survival. That's a good point. Yeah, so there's a question by Claudio Giorgio Giancaterino on conformal predictions. Unfortunately, I'm not so knowledgeable about conformal predictions. Maybe we can take that offline, because I don't think I can say something meaningful about that at the moment. Yes, and I can also share some code examples. Yeah, any suggestions for what to do when countermeasures are performed on the population? Yes, so then we probably need to model that and mark the subpopulation, have this as a feature. I mean, that's typically what you also do in medicine. I mean, you will compare the survival curve with some medication against without the medication, and try to see, okay, do you have a significant effect on the literal survival of people.
Okay, so I think for the sake of time, we can go ahead and wrap up the session. Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. If you'd like to continue the discussion, please feel free to use the lounge area that's open in the reception for small group discussions. But yeah, thank you again. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Peyton. And yeah, have a good day, everyone.